what we usually do is first of all ask you a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in this research, and maybe saying again some of the things we said about those networks, and then a little bit about sort of how you've connected with Mexican NGOs and other NGOs around here and those networks, and sort of where we think the future's going. Is that fair enough? Pretty good? Okay. All right.
Okay, I trust you to remember all those questions.
Okay, well, I'm just letting you know where we're
'cause
kind
I
of
won't.
going. No, of course not.
Okay.
All right. Okay, Gwynn, you want to start?
Yep. Let's go.
Okay, the red light is on.
Yeah, it's on. Okay. All right, well, why don't we begin then with your telling us a little bit about your background and your life here at the University of Arizona and how you got involved in research and conservation in the Upper Gulf.
Okay, I got to the University of Arizona in 1977, and I had some small-scale research interests in the Puerto Penasco area, in a very esoteric part of my my traditional discipline, which is paleontology. So I was trained as a paleontologist, and we were working in an area called taphonomy. That is, how do organic remains make it into the fossil record? And one of the traditional ways of studying that sort of thing is to go out to a place like the tidal flats of Choya Bay, near Puerto Penasco, and compare the distribution and abundance of living species of mollusks, which have nice hard shells, to the distribution and abundance of dead remains. Live dead comparisons, it's called. And that's sort of classic taphonomy. It wasn't particularly focused on the conservation of anything going on in Choya Bay, but we certainly accumulated a lot of knowledge that on species that were present in the area, and and Peggy and Sato sort of taken some of our data and some of our work and used it in some of their work. But
Incidentally, we did talk to Peggy.
good, I should hope so.
Yes.
But I had gotten to a point where I'd done a lot of research there, and I was frankly getting bored with that particular spot. There was an enormous amount of development going on in the area, which made me really uncomfortable and wasn't nearly as pleasant doing field work in that area anymore. Human activity was sort of trashing the place. There were a lot of collectors out there. But basically, I was tired of it, and I had asked a colleague of mine here in the department who had just gotten her pilot's license, wouldn't she be interested in flying over the Colorado River Delta, because I had never seen it from the air or from the ground, and I was sort of curious about the whole thing. And she was enthusiastic, just having gotten her license, and a bit of an adventure crossing the border in a small plane. So she said, sure. So up we went into the air and flew over the Delta, and I just my jaw just dropped. I mean, it was just this. From a geological perspective, it was just this fabulous place, and it was, despite the fact that it's in this really quite close to a lot of large population centers, really remote.
Yeah.
So that was very appealing, to see it from the air. So I said, okay, now what I got to do is I got to see it from the ground. So I got one of these. They used to give these out. International Studies gave out these small grants to sort of facilitate, international collaborations and international research, and I got one of those, and that was enough to get me, a postdoc and a new graduate student, fresh off the plane from Poland of all places, to go into the field. And we drove down there in a Chevy Suburban, and probably got stuck in the mud a couple of times, which is sort of what you do in that part of the world, and hired a boat to go out to some of the more remote areas up along the coastline of the Delta. And on that trip, we discovered that the beaches were made entirely of shells. What better place for somebody who was my research area is comparing live to dead. Beaches are made of shells. That's cool. And to deepen the puzzle, we couldn't find any live individuals of the species whose shells were making up all the beaches. And then I had what I refer to as a well, duh moment. Rather than an aha moment, because well, how stupid could I be? There's been no fresh water delivered to this place since about 1960 or so. Of course, the environment's changed.
Right.
And that's when I realized, what we could start to do is to use the dead shell remains as a measure of what the Delta was like before the dams, in a period of time that we, tongue-in-cheek, call the pre-Dambrian of the Colorado River Delta, okay? So, sort of off we went on sort of what we now call conservation paleobiology, if you will, using these empty shell remains as a baseline for what environment was like. You know, when they constructed Hoover Dam, there was no NEPA, there was no ESA, and besides, it was in Mexico. Who cares?
Right.
You know, so but that actually describes a pretty classic problem in a lot of conservation biology. You don't know what things were like before there was human impact.
Right.
So here we were, you know, we figured we could invent a whole bunch of techniques and approaches, borrow them from paleoecology basically, and say, okay, we can reconstruct baseline conditions, and that way it's a way of us for measuring impact. So, you know, my students and I published a bunch of papers. We started getting geochemistry involved, oxygen isotopes in the shells, which are sensitive to, in this particular case, the amount of fresh water arriving from the Colorado River. So we started making, you know, started publishing some papers, and those caught the attention, I think, I would have to say, I think they caught the attention of Environmental Defense,
Okay.
of Jennifer Pitt at Environmental Defense.
Okay.
I'm not really sure of this, but I didn't seek them out initially. I think they sought me out, and besides getting a reprint request from the Imperial Irrigation District, which I thought was pretty cool, you know, I started to learn, get familiar with the people who were interested in conservation issues on the Delta. So I had come at it from a completely independent direction, as a really great sort of scientific puzzle that I thought could be solved. So we started to do some more of that research with, again, with isotopes and shells, and in later cases with fish otoliths, the ear bones of fish. We could actually take the next step and say, okay, we recognize that, you know, restoring this whole habitat is not in the cards. What would it take to restore a significant piece of it? How much water, in other words, how much water would it take? So we started getting into issues of restoration. And I think long about that time, I realized that what we had done, and Ed Glenn had done some of this with some of his co-workers in Mexico with regard to shrimp and responsive shrimp harvest to water flow. But we began to build a case that, yes, indeed, here is documentation of the fact that the Colorado River Delta and estuary were seriously affected by upstream water diversions. Now, that may seem like such an obvious sort of thing,
Yeah.
that the burden of proof should be in the other direction, but
Right.
nevertheless, it really isn't in these
No, it
sorts of
isn't.
things. So I think that made it impossible began to make it possible, not everybody's convinced, began to make it impossible, I think, for the water buffaloes on this side of the border to not be able to just say, oh, well, we don't know anything going on south of the border. You know, we don't know of any hard scientific evidence that this has had any impact at all. So I think a number of us, and I'm not just claiming credit for me, I think Ed Glenn and his colleagues had a lot of credit there as well. We began to make the case that, you know, this has had an impact, serious environmental impact. And we began to make the case that, you know, okay, not only do you need water, which is an obvious thing to say, in any sort of negotiation, and it's likely to take decades, you know, the first question they're going to ask you is, how much water?
Right.
If you can't answer that question, you might as well not be at the
Right.
table.
Right.
And when?
Yeah, and when? Yeah, when do you want the water? How do you want it? You know, so, and I think it's through some of those meetings of the enviro groups, the environmental NGOs occasionally, and they still do, have the coordination meetings on their work on the Delta here in town. They've had it
They
here
do.
too. I haven't had one in a couple of years, I think. But I started meeting people there, and I probably met Francisco there, or I might have met Francisco. I'm not sure where I met Francisco. But I was invited to give a talk at the famous September 11th, 2001 meeting in Mexicali.
Yeah, we heard about that.
You know, and I went over there with Ed Glenn and Pam Nagler, and sort of started to meet some of the IBWC officials and the Bureau of Reclamation officials, and started to learn about sort of the enviro groups and what they were trying to do down there. And all of the Sonoran Institute stuff is upstream from where I was working.
Right.
Riparian restoration or wetland restoration. But I gradually began to meet, Francisco and then Oswald and Yamilet and, the other sort of usual suspects in the deal. Salvador Glinda Beck from UABC. I met through my colleagues at UABC because I had spent a semester on sabbatical at UABC in Ensenada. That was in fall of 1999. think it was, when I was there. So I met some of the people there, had projects going on with them. And then I think what's the next step in some of this? The next step in some of this, I think, was my submitting a proposal to the National Science Foundation to establish what NSF calls a Research Coordination Network, RCN. And RCNs are funded projects from NSF that, it's a funny sort of thing, they don't want you to do any research. They want you to facilitate research. So our pitch here was that we wanted to facilitate, here comes the standard pitch, we wanted to facilitate interdisciplinary, interinstitutional, and international research on the Colorado River Delta. And we tried to integrate from oceanography to social sciences, including legal scholarship, all having to do with the Colorado River Delta. You know, and we wanted to involve both research universities like the U of A, all the way to community colleges such as Arizona Western, because, well, Arizona Western's an obvious one for a couple of reasons. They're there. They have a very high minority student population, so we wanted to try to engage them as much as possible. We wanted to engage NGOs in this. My feeling is that academics in general, and I'll say geology departments in particular, have a long tradition of working with industry and doing industry contracts and that sort of stuff. So why don't they do more NGO stuff? Well, quick answer is NGOs don't have nearly as much money, but nevertheless, you know, it's part of the university's function in society to sort of work with these civil society organizations. So that's sort of another sort of pitch that I make. So I had no reluctance about sort of working with NGOs, even though some of my colleagues, I suspect, never said this to me, you know, well, you know, they have a research, they have an agenda. They're a special interest group, to which I usually respond, so is ExxonMobil. You know, okay, you know, so we're publishing data, it's open, it's out there, we're not, you know, we're not hiding anything, just in the same sort of way when ExxonMobil supports some of my colleagues in this department. We're not hiding any data, the data are out there for everybody, and everybody's free to publish, so everything's cool on that. We may not disagree on something, may not agree on everything, but it's not a problem.
You obviously had to have some of these relationships or your proposal wouldn't have been successful.
That's correct. I mean, I did a lot of sort of legwork in writing to my colleagues, saying, you know, would you, before I wrote the proposal,
Right,
before I submitted the
right.
proposal, and you know, they had to send in a testimonial letter, a support letter, and a CV, and that became part of the proposal.
Yes.
So I'm sure that helped us get funded.
But so you'd already
I'd already
done
developed
a lot of this
lot of
stuff.
contacts. That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
So this success fed on your previous investment.
I think that's fair to say.
Right,
Sure,
right.
You know, and then I expanded because people would tell me about, oh, you know, so-and-so knows so-and-so. Okay, well, sort of, let's
Right.
invite them on board.
Right. And it maybe has something to do with tradition at the University of Arizona, and I don't know whether or not you share this attitude, but this seems to be a very interdisciplinary, entrepreneurial place.
That's what I always say to prospective candidates here. Yes, I say that too. The walls between the departments are very low, and it's easy to sort of, you know, move from one discipline to another. I was interim department head in ecology and evolutionary biology for 2.5 years.
That's,
You know, obviously Laura Lopez Hoffman was my postdoc for a year and a half before she got her faculty position over there. So yeah, I mean, it's not a problem.
Yeah.
It seems
Well, it
normal
is-
to me, you know, because I've been here for so long. But I understand
Right.
from my colleagues elsewhere.
Well, I didn't
When I've gone on
realize it.
sabbatical elsewhere, I realize, oh, that's not really the way it is. Things are much more compartmentalized at a lot of other.
Well, it's certainly true with the University of California, and it shocked me.
Is that right?
Yes. I
Uh-huh.
had thought that Udall Center could be built anywhere, but it really,
Oh,
you know, it
okay.
takes low walls
Right,
in order to be
Yeah.
able to hop over them with any kind of ease.
right.
And a long tradition, I think, of people at this university being involved in real-world problems. We talked earlier about Tumamoc Hill
Mm-hmm.
and the sort of involvement in conservation efforts. Paul Martin and others
Sure, sure.
have been around here a long
Mhm.
time.
Right.
Talk to us a little bit about those groups, environmental groups in particular, and also those in Mexico that you've sort of.
The
connected
environmental groups I've met, at one time I got $1,000 worth of support from the Center for Biological Diversity,
with.
of all people. Okay?
That's surprising.
they were very interested to see if they could justify, or basically were just to see if I was willing to do the work to justify a listing of this species of mollusk that is now rare. That would give them some legal leverage in lawsuits. I mean, the center is certainly one of the more litigious of the environmental NGOs.
Right.
You know, and they wanted to sort of speed my research along to sort of help them out in that regard. It didn't turn out to be the case, but it was not very much money either.
Right.
But it got Miguel Diaz and I sort of in the field and sort of exploring along the coast of Sonora for other populations of the species and some morphological analyses. So, you know, it pushed a little bit of the research forward. I got a small grant of about $10K or so from Environmental Defense
Uh-huh.
to support a student doing some isotopic work on the shells. Again, getting at the issue of how much water would it take to restore the population of this species.
So
But
it's-
I went to one of these Santa Fe conferences,
Yes.
you know, one time and sort of hung out with the enviros and sort of watched the water lawyers, you know, do their thing. I sat in on Robert Glennon's water law class, which was, you know, terrifically fun. And, you know, then later took Robert into the Delta where he tried to do some fly fishing in a tidal channel just so he could say he did it. You know, so he and I have stayed close friends and colleagues on Delta and water issues over
Yeah.
the years. So I started to learn about, you know, water law and those sorts of things because I felt like I really had to.
Right.
And I began to appreciate, probably listening to Jennifer initially, how complicated the law of the river was, and all the ins and outs, and how you really had to show that you understood all that before you could talk to some of the water buffaloes
Yes.
on this side of the border. So my principal contacts really then, you know, initially Center for Biological Diversity they're not doing anything on the Delta right now that I know of. People I met in the course of these events, you know, Carrie Gillen at Defenders of Wildlife. Defenders has been was early involved in the lawsuit coming out of the initial attempts at the multi-species conservation plan. So I was fascinated by that, and I saw I forget who the guy was who took that to the Supreme Court, but I met him when I was in DC one time and talked to him at the Defender's office in DC. Other NGOs, Pacific Institute, Michael Cohn at Pacific Institute. He and Jennifer are husband and wife.
Huh.
So, you know, who knows what they talk about at the breakfast table. So, you know, they were frequently at the same meetings, and Michael is a sort of water policy analyst and was involved in salt and sea stuff a lot and involved in cross-border water as well. And he's also in Boulder. Can't remember this. You know, the National Wildlife Federation, I knew they were doing stuff, but I wasn't really connected to them in any way. Nature Conservancy has not been a player in the sort of stuff I've been involved with, so I never really dealt with anything that they're doing. And you know, Pro Natura is the principal Mexican organization, and you know, sort of they showed up on my radar principally because of Oslo.
Did we talk to anybody at Pro Natura?
No, we have a message into Oslo.
Okay.
Hopefully we'll get it.
Okay.
You could put a good word in.
Sure.
I don't know him, so
Oh, he's a great guy.
yeah,
He's a great guy.
Bill Shaw, we've heard that from several folks.
You really
And Francisco,
do,
yeah.
Pro Natura is near as I can tell. I don't know the landscape as well in Mexico. Pro Natura is the environmental group in Mexico. If you want to get anything done,
Mm-hmm.
you know, they're the biggest, and they work to get stuff done.
Yeah.
And you know, Sonoran Institute, of course, I got involved with because they were local. I spent, again, I'm jumping around in the
No, that's
calendar here a
fine.
bit for you, but my last sabbatical was 2005, 2006, or 2006, 2007. 2006, I was in the fall semester, I was at Cornell. In the spring semester, I said, I'm going to see if I can get an office out of the Sonoran Institute, and I'll be their scientist in residence for a semester. And I was curious to see, you know, how they worked and what they did, and what sort of scientific issues, you know, would come up. And I was pleased to find out they were really, really simple scientific issues, and you know that I could be of some use. And they were doing stuff that was of interest to me. I was keen on issues of ecosystem valuation at the time, ecosystem service valuation at the time. I had one of these. Even before then, again, I'm jumping around the calendar. I wish I could tell you the actual date, but I had one of these Udall fellowships.
Aha, that makes me feel good.
There
That
you
was
go.
my idea.
That was your idea. It's a great idea.
It was a really good idea.
So that's where I got to, that's where I got to meet and know Bob Faraday.
Yeah, I hired Bob.
Okay, smart move.
Yeah.
I knew of Bob's work a little bit from some of the Delta publications that he had done for the
Right.
Conference of Riverside many years ago.
Right, I know
Which
that.
I funded when I was at EPA, just to
Oh, okay.
make a very small
Right.
loop for you.
Okay.
Well, that's
Yeah,
part of
right.
this.
It's not 6 degrees of separation. It's probably only 1 or 2 here, right?
Exactly.
Well, I think that's what's so fascinating about this, how generative these things have been. Listening to your story, it's clear you did research which was then found useful by environmental groups who then encouraged you in certain directions, not with big money, but money to train graduate students
Right.
who are part then of what kind of feeds forward,
Sure.
which then led to your further involvement with those groups,
Right.
including this scientific thing. So, in fact, this is the weaving of a network from some early strands into, in your case, quite a broad
Right.
group of connections,
Right.
which now has, as I understand it, some real policy
Well, right now,
applications.
we're involved with the Cienega de Santa Clara,
Right.
and I think that didn't just happen either. Of course, that work started out. At least it started out in fall 2006. That's right, because that's when it just started. We had gotten, at the encouragement, I think, of Jennifer. We applied for one of these Water Resource Research Center small grants. I forget what
Yeah.
they were called at the time.
Nice.
To establish a small-scale monitoring program at the Cienega de Santa Clara. And I think that I got fingered, not because I have any expertise in wetland monitoring. I don't. I'm a marine guy. This stuff is way too fresh water for me, but I think I was probably the most active American scientist working on the Delta. And so it was a situation where the money couldn't be allocated directly to Mexicans to doing this sort of work.
Right.
It couldn't go to an NGO, but they were happy to have, somebody from the U of A, and here's where it's great being an academic, because you're sort of like Switzerland.
Yeah.
All this stuff, you can sort of talk to anybody. And we got basically some matching money from Sid Wilson at CAP
Uh-huh.
for this. And that was an outcome of the famous white paper on the Cienega de Santa Clara and the Yuma desalting plant that Sid, Jennifer, and some other NGOs and some other water agencies put together, which said, in effect, was an agreement that the NGOs would support the operation of the YDP so long as no harm came to the YDP. So long as no harm came to the Cienega as a result. And it also called for monitoring, environmental monitoring. So that was the start of that in fall 2006, spring actually was the application. But we started doing some studies in that fall. And that's where, that involved Jacqueline Garcia at CI in Sonora. That involved Francisco and Sonoran Institute. I'm not sure if Jorge Ramirez was involved in those early. He's a hydrologist at UABC in Mexicali. And Oswald, of course, knew what was going on because Oswald knows everything that's going on.
Okay.
And I think from that was in preparation for the 10% trial run of the YDP back in spring of 2007. Fast forward to the current 30% run, we were then asked to submit a proposal to the 3 big water agencies for a much more ambitious monitoring program that included analysis that was not just water quality, but included analysis of vegetation, distribution, and abundance, included birds, less satellite imagery, a little bit more hydrology to understand sort of how that whole system worked. So we're now, that was funded technically back almost a year ago in August 2000.
That's the one Margaret Wilder's involved in?
Margaret's not involved with that.
Not
She's
in-
involved with something else on the Delta, but she's
Okay,
not
all
involved
right,
with
not
She
in
talked
this.
about that, I think, at the talk.
Yes,
she
that's
gave.
right, that's why I got
gave her
that
a whole bunch
impression.
of-
Yeah,
gave
I
her a whole
have
bunch of
actually a
slides.
tape of that, yeah,
Okay, but
Yeah.
she's not directly involved
yeah,
with that.
yeah.
And that's, so we're doing that now. You know, I just came back from a meeting last week of technically the program didn't actually begin until the IBWC and CELA, you know, officially blessed it. You know, we have to go through all that sort of
Right.
stuff. So we had our kickoff meeting last week, you know, 6 months into the project or so. Sorry, it's 8 months into the project. And so we sort of presented some of our results to date. And, Jennifer McCluskey from Bureau of Reclamation is chief engineer of the Yuma operation, was there to talk about that. But technically the meeting was convened by IBWC and CELA. In fact, Placido dos Santos, who works for CAP, who's basically our handler for this particular project, you know, was trying to make sure all the diplomatic niceties were settled. Interesting sort of side story here. Back in the original small-scale monitoring program, this was done, and you'll relate to this. This was done, you know, more or less by CAP
Yes,
and me and some of my Mexican colleagues.
yes,
And I didn't realize that we what we had done exactly, because it turns out, in my thinking, this is in the long-standing tradition of people who live along the border trying to solve problems across the border among themselves without involving the central government. Thank you very much.
right,
Right?
right,
So I was very proud of being involved in this project. So when I was in DC one time, I went off to see the IBWC representative in the State Department in DC. You know, it's a one-woman show. But I was in DC. I figured I should do this, and that was sort of fun going to the State Department. So she was a little miffed. It turns out that the IBWC in El Paso was a little bit miffed. I never really got much beyond the vibes on this, but I got the feeling they didn't like this sort of freelance diplomacy of, you know,
Yeah.
people solving these problems that they had along the border just among themselves. They felt like they should
they
be
like to be
involved.
they like to be central in it,
Yep.
but they don't do anything.
No, they don't. But it's better that they used to be much more obstructionist.
Yes, they were.
You know, now I think they are cooperative, and they are trying to find ways in which they can, you know, move issues forward. They have these working groups that I'm not involved with, but Jennifer and Francisco and Oswald are. We've been involved stakeholders and the water agencies and that sort of thing. But now the IBWC has been very, very helpful. I probably turn off the tapes,
No,
but
it's okay. We won't-
Francisco Bernal of
Right.
CELA has been
Right.
extraordinarily helpful to
Right.
us in a lot of ways, not least of them. He takes a lot of our instrumentation across the border, so we don't have to pay duty on some pretty fancy electronics. That would otherwise be a problem for us. They're facilitating our use of a Bureau of Reclamation airboat that's going to try to get us into some of the more remote parts of the Cienega. That's been, so CELA has been enormously helpful.
Yeah. Arturo Herrera was always such a great, and I gather his replacement is
Replacement is also very good
very
in
good.
that regard, yes.
You know, before we go too far, I want to be sure I understand something. What you're sort of saying is that the early agreement that the desalting plant could operate so long as it didn't affect the Cienega, that gave all these agencies a stake in further research. Is that true?
I think that's true. Yeah, if it weren't for that agreement,
Yeah.
you know, the U.S. side would have just gone ahead with their environmental assessment and sort of said, well, there's no harm to the environment between the Yuma desalting plant and the border, let's go.
Okay. So in
Which is
some-
basically what they did, but
Yeah.
you know, so they're doing this. You know, you should read some of the you read some of the documentation of this. You know, they're doing this out of international comity. They're not doing this because they have to.
Right.
You know, they're very careful about saying, you know, we don't have to do this
Right.
because EPA stops at the border, ESA stops at the border, NEPA stops at the border, and I teased Jennifer McCloskey a little bit last week because I started, because they're actually having some replacement water. I don't know if you've heard about that part of the agreement. So they're trying to replace some of the water that would otherwise have gone to the Cienega, 10,000 feet from the U.S. side, 10,000 feet from the Mexican side, 10,000 acre feet from the NGOs. So we were discussing the scheduled delivery of some of that water at this meeting, and I said, I sort of knew I'd get a rise out of it. I said, well, part of the problem with this mitigation water. Oh, no, oh, it's not mitigation water. This is not mitigation water. I'll have, my solicitor will tell you this is not mitigation. Okay, call it what you will.
Yeah.
Can't call it mitigation water because that's a confession that they're doing
That
something
they're doing
bad.
damage.
Right. So I said, okay, we'll.
But it was a political fear, as I understand you to say, because they were cultivating NGO support.
Yes. I think
So that's what drove the agreement
I
and
think
the
that's
white
right.
paper in the first place.
That's
It was
right.
just a cultivation of a NGO approval or a nod of approval.
Yeah, well, I think also Sid Wilson was smart enough to realize that if he didn't cultivate the NGOs and get this sort of an agreement,
They'd be
he would
locked
get tied
in
up in
court.
courts
Yeah,
for a
exactly.
really long time.
Yeah.
He would delay the project and it would cost a lot of money. So a lot of times when I give talks on this particular topic, I point out that scientists are a lot cheaper than lawyers. We work for a lot less. And if you can find a scientific and engineering solution to the problem, let's do that instead of being lawyers. And I think the contrast is, and Helen, you probably know more
Yeah.
about this case than I do. The contrast between the contrast between this sort of Arizona Sonora issue is very high compared to the lining of the All-American Canal controversy between California and Baja California. That really upset the Mexicans.
Oh, really upset the Mexicans.
And it tied up the project
Right.
in courts for a
right.
while.
Yeah, it did.
So, where's the gain there?
Right.
You know?
Right. But it's kind of interesting that the result of it has been a great deal more data.
Which?
Is that the whole
Cienega
business,
project?
yes,
Yes.
of they have more data all the time, which then feeds into a stronger case.
That's right. Yeah.
Right.
Right.
At the same time as it accomplishes these other things, which is the training of graduate students. And
Well, right. That's right. It does. And we've gotten graduate students. There are 2 graduate students currently here, 2 Mexican students supported by CONACYT, who are working on projects associated with this. They're both working with Ed Glenn and me to some extent. Laura and I are trying to recruit a 3rd student, Mauricio from Hermosillo, to work on the project. I've got a student coming in from UTEP. He might not work on the Cienega. He's probably going to work on some of the Rio Hardy work that we're doing. But, it's now become sort of a training ground for this sort of thing, sure. Well, Oswald's a U of A product. Yamilet's a U of A product. I mean, and Oswald is, Oswald's on the way up. He's going to be one of the leading figures in Pornatura in not very much time. The only downside of that is he's probably going to have to live in Mexico City.
Yeah.
So we have heard quite a bit about this, of sort of this young, educated cadre. When I started working on the border, and when Helen, and obviously way back when you did
Yeah.
as well, there just wasn't the counterparts on the Mexico side as there are today.
Oh, okay.
Tremendous
Yeah.
void, no NGO presence really,
Right. That's right.
especially in this part of the world. There
Yeah.
was a lot down in Chiapas and
Right.
where you have the big biodiversity.
Yeah.
And so you're also seeing that.
Yeah, I'm also seeing that.
Large.
And my colleagues, when I hung out at OMSA, they're sort of become, Miguel Diaz has now more interest in the conservation side of things. So even though he wasn't sort of trained here, I think sort of he got, as it were, entrained in all of these sorts of projects. He and Memo Avila, worked on some of these projects with us, here. So both of them spent a sabbatical semester on campus. So that is training. Both of these guys, Mexican Regional University, sort of got to go to a big research university for a while and learn some new tricks and approaches.
We interviewed Alberto Burquez,
I don't know him.
but he
I know
also,
of him, of course.
yeah, of course. He talked also of the importance of being in the field together. And that sounds like that also is an experience that you're bringing people down there to
You can't
experience.
do this. You can't do this without doing that.
Touching it
Absolutely. And one of the things that impressed me and sort of changed my style in the field is watching my Mexican colleagues in the field. They are absolutely gifted and determined and vigorous, and will and again, don't require much in the way of resources to get the job done. All us Americans, we think we need all this gear and high-tech stuff. And, geez, you don't really need that sort of thing. And, now when I get stuck in the mud in Mexico, I know everybody gets stuck in the mud. It doesn't, I'm trying to lose my Northern European attitudes toward these things, and I don't worry about that sort of thing very much anymore.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, okay, so I need a boat to get out to the islands. I show up at one of the little campos north of San Felipe, and is Ramon here? Oh no, he'll be back in a few hours. Okay, okay, just sort of hang out. It's a different style, but what the U.S. I think one of the things I think a lot of times is what the U.S. can provide are sort of the high tech and some of the dollars, and because of the difference in economies and because of the differences in technologies in Mexico, you can get people to do the fieldwork stuff incredibly well and incredibly cheaply. And I think this carries over to this obviously carries over to restoration. One of the things I'm trying to find somebody to do is to sort of compare the approaches toward restoration in the lower Colorado River north of the border to restoration, sort of south of the border. North of the border, you bring in the bulldozers and you sort of, plow the ground and you plant things, 2 feet from each other and, acres and acres of stuff, and you meet the rules and you walk away. Oh, well, you can't really walk away because it's high maintenance stuff. You got to clear the salt cedar every now and then. Mexico, it's a small scale operation. It's very labor intensive. There are no bulldozers. It's just people with Roundup and, pickaxes and stuff like that. I'd like to know, what's the cost of restoration per hectare in those two places?
Right,
Is one more likely to be more long-lasting and self-sufficient than the other one is much more high maintenance and requires constant infusions of money.
It also may involve greater support from grassroots people, especially if they're employed in these kind of activities, rather than employing some big engineering firm that comes in from the outside.
Right. Yeah, well, one of the things we're doing in the Cienega, of course, is we've hired a couple of local people from the Cienega as part of our field crew. And Oswell hires people from the Cienega as part of his field crew for the bird surveys. We had a small grant from the Christensen Fund to do some work in the Rio Hardy. And we pitched that as, citizen scientists. We wanted to train the people who lived along the lower Rio Hardy how to use these water quality instruments and how to send the data back to us. So again, that sort of teaches people, gets them invested in the local environment and sort of better stewards, of it.
We already touched on this issue implicitly, so let's make it a little more explicit. One of our questions has been the kind of people who make good networkers in the sense of crossing these boundaries. And you've mentioned some things. One is appreciation of the culture. And it seems to me you have to kind of slow down some and be more willing to be patient and creative. You speak Spanish?
Very badly.
Yeah, me too.
It's really interesting, which is, I figured I would really probably get a hell of a lot more done if I spoke better Spanish.
Yeah, me too.
And I'm ashamed of myself, but.
Well, all three of us struggle, but at least we struggle.
Right. Yeah.
Which is.
Right.
Right. Are there other characteristics that you've noticed of the kinds of people? Well, we've talked about the institutional characteristics of the University of Arizona, that it has, it's entrepreneurial and you can walk across boundaries, and it's pretty good about allowing people to do real world research and not claiming that's not research because it's not simply theoretical, but that it has an applied aspect to it. But are there common characteristics of the people who take these kinds of unconventional academic risks? And I think they still are a little bit of risk.
I'm not sure. I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure. I think that they're really that high risk, or that they're that high risk anymore.
Okay.
If you're talking to somebody who's a geologist, I'm in a geology department. Geology departments have a long, as I mentioned before, long history of sort of collaborations and contractual.
Well, and McCullough was all those years ago involved in a lot of stuff.
That's right. That's right. And we have people here who have contracts with ConocoPhillips and with ExxonMobil. And, a lot of our graduates go on to work for companies, including BP, who've been, but never, that's another story. So, a lot of our graduates go off into industry. So we do a lot of non-theoretical work, but we do scholarly work.
Right.
We publish the results of our work regardless of who funds it and who might be interested in it for their own particular purposes. So I'd say from the university's perspective, or at least perspective of the science department, what's the problem there? There's no problem there. There's no real risk there. So long as you are, and again, I have my department head's hat on, as long as you're bringing in money, you're training students, and you're publishing papers.
Right.
Now, that may be a geology department tradition, but I don't think it's restricted in this campus to that. I mean, obviously a program like natural resources, long tradition of working with stakeholders,
Right.
on non-theoretical, sort of more, let's put it this way, more applied research. So I'm not sure that's a big risk
problem.
here.
Okay.
I'm not sure I would advise a junior faculty member, someone who's on tenure, to go whole hog into this, because the big money's not there. It's harder to get established, in a discipline by working on what I would call a local problem. I left one career behind as a card-carrying paleontologist, and now I'm sort of retraining myself as a conservation biologist, and I'm probably best known in the region for doing that. One of the problems, I would say, with this sort of approach is, in my experience with the Delta at any rate, is everybody's much too inward-looking. They're very familiar with what each other are doing, but I don't think they're as familiar as they should be with, okay, the federal government's spending billions of dollars in restoration in the Everglades. What the hell's going on in the Everglades? Spending billions of dollars in San Francisco Bay Delta. What's going, how are they doing that up there? Are they having, what sort of success stories have they got?
Right.
There's not enough of that, and that comes from, that's a more academic approach, where I say, well, I want to know about cattail marshes.
Right.
So, Santa Clara is just a big cattail marsh. I ask a lot of my colleagues, well, what about cattail marshes elsewhere? And they go, huh?
Yeah. Do you
There's
think
an
part
enormous
of it?
literature on cattail marshes. Come on,
Yeah.
we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time we go in the field.
Do you think part of it has to do with what we've discovered about people's motivations, not necessarily people at the university, in fact, some people at the university, but more likely to be kind of tangential to it? Their love of place, which makes it by definition a kind of local problem. This
Yeah.
is a unique place. There's no place else on the globe quite like this. The Pentecotes is particularly described that way. So that kind of discourages this comparative kind of research.
It does, but what should encourage it is funding. Now, some funding goes from foundations for environmental issues is very place-based.
Right.
But if I'm writing a proposal to the National Science Foundation, they don't really give a damn about the Colorado Delta per se.
No, they don't.
But if I can tell them, as I've told them, I'm developing techniques that are useful in conservation biology elsewhere, they go, oh, okay. They see that's part of the broader implications criteria.
Right.
If I see ways of measuring vegetation density and distribution with satellite imagery, okay, and I happen to be doing it on the Cienega and Santa Clara, okay, then I can get that sort of agency, some more scientific funding rather than strictly applied sort of stuff. So I think that's the fine line that I've always tried to walk here. Sort of I'm not just, even though I love this place, obviously,
Right,
I'm dedicated to it, and there's issues of environmental justice that also sort of fascinate me about the whole thing. But, as I work on it, I always keep an eye out for, okay, what's the general problem that I'm addressing, and how can I address the general problem in this particular place?
So, I have a question. How important are the institutions like the Upper Gulf Biosphere Reserve? Do you think that without that it would be worse off today than, because Francisco, we had asked him, well, so what's the goal here? And it sounded like it was actually more institutional mechanisms put in place that are long lasting, and yet we've been focusing on the people and the networks and the importance of them. So could you maybe speak about chicken or egg, which is most important?
One thing that got left out was, sort of the habitats themselves.
Mm-hmm.
That didn't get mentioned as sort of what the objective is here. My ultimate objective
Yes,
is to
right.
sort of is to deliver more water to the Gulf of California, and thus restore environments. Now, I do, so some of that's a scientific issue. So anyway, back to your generating question about the biosphere reserve. I think a biosphere reserve is tremendously important here.
Mm-hmm.
It gives I trot that out whenever I can as a rationale for doing what we're doing. It's a measure of the Mexican government's recognition that this is an important environment.
Mm-hmm.
And it represents the stake that the Mexican government has basically invested in. I mean, it's a protected area, but not of course the way in which we protect our parks, but it's more a national forest sort of thing, very accommodationist to people living there, as it has to be in Mexico. But yeah, as soon as you say it gives that place some status and some level of protection that it wouldn't otherwise have. Of course they're tremendously underfunded. Of course they can't do everything that they'd like to be able to do. But they've been tremendously helpful. Jose has been tremendously helpful to me in facilitating my research and introducing me to the right people. And I used the field station north of El Golfo before it was trashed. And I get sort of letters of permission, in the past, until very recently. I've always done this as a tourist. I've never had official permits. Because that's also this sort of local thing, you got to show a letter. Everybody knows Jose. You got a letter from Jose. The federales or the police or anybody. Oh, okay. No problem. It's a sort of, it's personal relationships are very important in Mexico. Now because we're doing this under the aegis of IBWC and these water agencies, we were very, very careful to get official permisos from all the relevant agencies. So we're covered now in that regard. And also because last summer we had a horrible experience with a couple of our students getting arrested in Brazil for not having appropriate permits. So I have to be sort of doubly careful on doing this, for setting an example for my colleagues as well. But that's a different story. Institutions, the Biosphere Reserve, we couldn't. I can't imagine us getting as far as we've gotten without the Biosphere Reserve.
But you think these federal agencies on the whole are, the usual picture of federal agencies, particularly the Bureau of Reclamation, has been that it's interested only in things that are norther than the border, and that it wants to do things the way it always has, and you can't move it almost ever. So in some sense, it's an impediment to getting things done. And it's interesting that as collaborators, or at least cooperators in your project, you seem to list people in federal agencies who seem to have bought into that. How do you explain their sort of willingness to cooperate? Is my perspective an old one, and these agencies are changing, or?
I think these agencies are changing. The water agencies are slowly changing. I mean, Sid Wilson, I thought, was very far forward-thinking kind of guy. My hunch is so is David Modier. Not just because he comes from Tucson, but because the measure of progress here might be, Sid Wilson was actually willing to admit that climate change was going on. He didn't care whether humans were causing it or not. David Modier, I think, realizes that humans are causing it. So that's progress.
Right, it is.
I think some of the water agencies, Southern Nevada with Pat Mulroy, has been sort of out in front of things more so than CAP.
Right.
In the past history. Southern, Metropolitan Water Southern California is probably more traditional water buffalo type of stuff. So I think these agencies are slowly changing as the old guard dies off. Not because they've sort of, had a conversion on the road to Damascus, but because, they're just sort of replacing people and they have different perspectives. Bureau of Reclamation, obviously, is a captive agency.
Yes.
But they, I think, very slowly, and the people I've been dealing with at the Bureau of Reclamation historically, Jim Cherry, who was Jennifer McCluskey's predecessor, and now Jennifer, they realize now that they have to work with a broader range of people than they've had to work with in the past. The only people they used to have to work with in the past were the agricultural interests and the major water agencies, because they're contracted to do their job, delivering water to those users of water. And now they've slowly recognized, well, there are other users of water. It's going to take a really long time.
Yeah.
But, I think there's slow progress. I think there is slow progress.
You think that's the case even though there's this mounting scarcity of water? I think the thing that worries me the most about this, and I'm not the one being interviewed, but at the same time as you're showing a greater need for ecological services and the level of scarcity of water. I just came from Los Angeles, and there was a long article, front page article in the Los Angeles Times about the scarcity of water in California, and even though the drought is over, the water problems aren't,
Right.
And so then the
Damn
question...
Delta smelts,
There's this little tiny thing.
That's right. Yeah.
Which is another thing that,
Yeah.
sometimes we don't, CalFed didn't always learn from the Everglades and back and
That's
forth.
right.
We've got
That's
our
right.
own problems
That's right.
of learning these things back and forth. But in any case, it is, I can't remember where I was going with this. Do you remember? I got interested in Delta smelt suddenly.
Yeah, the question is, the question I see coming is,
Right.
how can you be optimistic in the
Exactly.
face?
That was precisely where I was.
No water here.
Well, shit, we're oversubscribed already.
Right.
So it's not like there's a lot of extra water lying around now.
No.
So, in the future there's going to be, yes, there's going to be less water, but I'm not actually concerned about the fact that there's going to be less water in the future. I'm concerned about the fact that demand is going to increase. If we can get the water agencies to think a little beyond the supply side
Right.
and to start recognizing that there's a lot to be gained by controlling the demand side, we'll be okay.
Yes.
And if development and population growth continues in the desert Southwest, as it's likely to, there's simply going to be less farming. Now that has some bad consequences for the environment because there's less return flow. But nevertheless, it's going to be evolved, a sort of transfer. That's going to, we're seeing the traditional structure of water use and water law in the Southwest. It's getting on shaky grounds, sort of things are loosening up a fair bit in that regard because of the demand problem, because of the price of water. It's going to be ultimately it's going to be politically impossible for Imperial Valley farmers to continue to pay $16 an acre for their water. The rest of the state of California won't put up with it if they ever really catch on.
Yeah.
Right? That gives a little bit of an opening, I think, for the environment, because as that battle between the farms and the cities goes on, the environmental groups, which are basically based in the cities, not in the agricultural areas, they're going to see that opening, and I think they're going to get in there and start looking at it. You did see that. Now this may be a false start, but we saw that with the quantification settlement agreement. Okay, Imperial Irrigation, okay, they finally agreed, we're going to sell the water to LA and San Diego. But then they said, ID said, no, we can't do that, because if we do that, more of our fields will lie fallow, which means that less water will go to the Salton Sea.
Right.
We don't want to be responsible for environmental damage to the Salton Sea. Basically, they threw a spanner in the works, right? The way they solved that problem, and I'm not sure who did, they didn't even tell me, they said, brilliant idea. They said, okay, California said, instead of what you're not going to do, IAD, you're going to sell the water to us at $300 an acre foot. We're going to sell it to San Diego and Los Angeles for $350 an acre foot. And we're going to put that $50 into a restoration fund for the Salton Sea, and therefore you guys won't be liable.
Yeah.
That is, that's an allocation of water from nature. It never was quite phrased in that way, but that's a set aside, and that's basically like it's in a sense, it's a user fee for water. As people in LA and San Diego are now paying, in effect, a user fee for that water to compensate for the environmental costs of what they're doing. $50 an acre foot is woefully inadequate. How they arrived at that number, I have no idea. It was probably whatever the traffic would bear at the time. But there's an opening.
Right.
right?
And whether you can really do anything about the Salton Sea is another really.
It's another, but exactly, but I think this is a tremendous precedent.
So do I. Yeah, it's terrific. And it's not so different from what you're doing in the Upper Gulf in a sense, because it's a implicit admission of environmental consequences of upstream diversions of
Right.
water.
That's right. Sure.
And a sort of pattern then for any additional diversions related to demand will now require this kind of mitigation, even if we
I think
can't
it
use
should.
that.
I think it
Even
should.
if we can't use that
Even if we
term.
can't use that word, yeah.
Right,
Right.
right. Okay,
You know, so eventually, you know, I think we'll see nature get standing in the law of the river.
okay.
Doesn't have it now. Mexican water laws ahead of us in that regard. But eventually, I think we'll get there.
So
not
in
in,
that
not in any
sense-
sort of direct way. Nobody's ever
Right,
going to ever
right,
overturn the law of the
right,
river.
right.
You know, you're only going to sneak in these adjustments.
But it's a
Francis-
good answer to,
Francisco was also quite excited about that MSCP funding finally
Yes.
being allowed to be
If you
used
credit
in Mexico.
restoration on the Mexican side of the border
Right.
to the MSCP.
When I was
think
at
that's
EPA, we were
that's
really
great.
advocating for that, and
Yeah.
so it's nice to see that eventually happen.
I'm not sure that's happened yet, has it?
No, but it sounds like it's
Sounds like it's
moving in that direction.
Okay,
Yeah.
good.
yeah.
Yeah,
Well-
that's another way. in
Yeah,
which,
exactly.
You know, you're allocating money.
I was just thinking that this is a nice summary of the question of how important are institutions, and there's nothing more institutional than the law of the river. And in some sense, the change of that law of the river, the slow evolution in this direction, will make a terrific difference.
Yeah, I mean, even some simple thing like, you know, minute 306.
Yes.
The environmental minute.
That's
Okay, that's a
good.
change.
That's
That's
another
the first
really good
explicit
example.
recognition. You know, and when the Enviros, you know, sort of fought to have that done and adopted it September 11th, 2001, you know, there was going to be this great press conference, you know, they were going to get all this. Oh, well. You know, that's been invoked.
Okay.
You know, it's been invoked with regard to the Cienega, invoked with regard to the Delta. You
Okay.
know, I know people build on that.
I need to ask you, because we've asked a lot of other people this, whether or not the recent problems with immigration and the negative valence of U.S.-Mexico relations. You know, it's just, every time you pick up the paper, Kyle this morning is using that word hostage, holding something hostage. You seem not so discouraged by this overlay. How do you see this activity at two levels, and one of them is sort of under the radar and people are going...
The courts do with it. Although certainly permanent damage has been done by just the fact of the laws, the bill's passage to begin with. It's hurt us directly in a couple of ways already. Really minor sort of things. The kickoff meeting for the Cienega project was in El Centro, California. You know, out of respect for our Mexican colleagues, feelings on travel to the state of Arizona.
So you
It's a
see-
minor inconvenience.
Yeah.
Nobody likes going to El Centro in June of all times, but yeah, it's not really that big a deal. We could have had it in Yuma otherwise. All right, no big problem. My Cienega work group has meetings every 3 months. Our next one's scheduled for here in Tucson in a few weeks. I suspect that a few of we alternate between Tucson and San Luis, Sonora. I suspect some of our folks might not come because of that. This potential graduate student we're recruiting for one aspect of the project, he's concerned about the environment in Arizona. Does he want to bring his family
Yeah.
here? Given SB 1070.
Is there any more news about CONACYT funding? Are they going to stop funding?
My understanding from Jose Rivera, who works for Dean Ruiz in Mexico City, is that CONACYT is going to allocate just as many fellowships to the U of A as it did in previous years.
Great, great. Well, that's at least, I hope nobody makes a fuss about that.
I hope not. Joaquin and some of his counterparts at UNAM are going to be publishing a letter in Science saying that we can't let this stand in the way of scientific collaborations.
Good, good.
You know, sort of it's mostly to, you know, again, you know, pressure to do this comes, I think, a large part from Mexico. You know, we want to continue these collaborations. They're tremendously important, I think, to people on both sides of the border.
Right, well, it's too bad they've been so insulted, but they were.
They were, right.
Right.
There are all sorts of discussions we can have about that, such as,
Right.
you know, their own immigration laws are probably just as bad, if not worse, than ours with regard to those sorts of
Right.
things. But
Right, that's not the point.
nevertheless, that's not the point. We thumbed our nose at them. State of Arizona thumbed their nose at Mexico.
Yes,
All of Latin America.
yes.
But Mexico, reasonably enough, sort of takes offense first, as well they should.
Yeah. How are we doing?
We're good.
I think we're finished, aren't you?
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
What do I see next in this?
I think we're going to get a transcription of this. I can show you that if you